It is finished is the sixth of the seven final words of Jesus from the cross. It is not his last word, but it is the word that he uttered at the moment when he began to realize that death was rushing upon him. Having been on the cross for 3 hours and tormented and abused over that time, in an ordeal through all of those hours, Jesus now recognizes that death will not wait, and it is coming. And in recognition of that, he makes a final witness to his life, but also to his mission and ministry. I think that if one only thinks about the fact that Jesus' earthly life is coming to an end, one could think about many different ways in which these words could be spoken. They could be spoken with resignation or a sense of giving up, particularly as one is dying at the hands of others. They could be said in bitterness or anger, but also in thanksgiving or even with a sense of relief. But none of that is what Jesus is about in saying this word. He is speaking of something larger than the death of his earthly body, but is talking about the longer picture of his life and ministry and mission to which he was called, and which he now sees is at its end, and makes a statement about that work. So that when he says it is finished, one of the things that we see is that often we will find parallel to that expression, similar translations that help to shape that and give greater understanding to it by using words like it is accomplished, it is completed, it is complete, it is whole, it is fulfilled, and helps us to understand that what Jesus is talking about is something which is longer in duration, which has a larger theological purpose and intent, and which he now can say at the very end of his life and at the end of his earthly ministry that he has done what he was called to do. He has completed the work he was given, and can say with honesty and satisfaction that he has accomplished the work of God, that God had intended for him. I think one of the ways that we can think about that or understand what that might mean for Jesus is to recognize that whenever we talk about the end of something, it always presupposes a beginning or will cast us in thought and imagination back to a beginning. I know that often as a priest, when I have accompanied someone in their final journey, been with them at their dying, it has been striking for me to look upon someone who's just made that passage and reflect that the long story of their life is now over. And now, and only now, can we look at their life and see it vested with a certain kind of coherence. It is a single narrative. We see where they began, or we always knew that, and now we see where they ended. And when one looks at the way that one's life was lived in between, in the journeying of one's life, and the ways that one filled one's days and years, it is a very moving thing to recognize the wholeness of someone's life. Now, for Jesus, this is also true. I have had the privilege of traveling in Israel, Palestine only a couple of times, but each time I've been able to spend some time in a stone cave room in Nazareth, which some scholars find reason to believe may have been the home in which Jesus was raised by Joseph and Mary. And I don't know if that's true. I'm certainly not going to make that claim, but that claim is out there. And when one is in that room in contemplation of that claim, it is powerful and causes one to think about all that Jesus left behind and where he came from when he first put his foot on the road that took him to Judea and ultimately into years as an itinerant preacher, though maybe Jesus didn't see that in his future at the time. What we do know is that Jesus left Nazareth and went to seek and find John the Baptist and to receive his baptism in the River Jordan. Where Jesus thought it was going to go from there, we have no idea. He, I think, found an affirmation of his growing call to missional work in his baptism, and then found some shaping and conviction for that in the temptations he experienced in the wilderness. But from there, we see Jesus traveling back to Galilee, traveling through the towns and cities of Galilee and over at the Mediterranean, in Capernaum and the northern cities, and then moving down, passing out of Judea altogether, out of Israel altogether, but returning, going down into the low country around Jericho, and finally, ultimately, coming up toward Jerusalem, traveling in Judea, and then ultimately turning his face to Jerusalem and making that final journey to the capital city into great danger and on a road that ultimately brought him to his cross. Now, the point that I would want to make is to say that I don't believe that when Jesus first set out on that journey, it is realistic to imagine that he could foresee where that road would take him. That when Jesus went to be baptized, that he could see that that road would ultimately bring him to the cross. But I believe that whenever someone fully and completely commits themselves to God, to the love of God, to the will of God, to the desire for God, to the divinity that one finds in God and ultimately can find in oneself through God, whenever one makes that commitment, and then in the course of their living, at every turn and every place of discernment, always making the decisions and choices of one's life in light of God and in God, eventually, gradually, one will find that the road we are on stops feeling like so much wandering and begins to have the kind of shape and direction that teaches us where we're going, helps us to see the road and where the road is leading. So that ultimately, as Jesus is on the cross, and maybe from that high perspective can, at least by imagination, look back all the way to Galilee and then retrace that journey of several years that took him everywhere among all people and then brought him finally to Jerusalem and to the cross, and then see from there what he did, the fidelity with which he responded to God's call and the fullness with which he lived it out. And only then, from that place, to be able maybe finally to see for the first time, so this is what it was about. To look back at the thousand decisions made all along the way, at every choice always made for God, in God, and to see, I see now that this is where I was always coming. This was the destiny and end of the road that was always waiting for me, and it is the cross. And then in the dying on the cross, to see for the first time, this is what God needed me to do. This is what God wanted from me. And then in the mystery of God and beyond our knowing, in that living and in that dying, somehow through Jesus, God saved the world. And in the moment when Jesus opens his eyes to see that, he is able with, I think, a heart filled and overflowing with love and gratitude to God, to look back and say, it is accomplished, it is finished, it is complete. The work you gave me to do, by your gracious goodness, I did. And those are the words he says as death finally comes over him and begins to bring him into that final passage. These are words not of a victor. They are not words of celebration. They are honest words of recognition and truth and of sudden self-discovery at the very last minute before he gave himself in that final offering to God. Thank you, and amen.